Voy a compartir mi pantalla. Vale. Bien, bueno, se puede ver, creo que mi presentación. I'm going to give my talk in English. This is one of two talks in which we are going to introduce the results of the lesser kestrel breeding population in Spain and the census that was carried out, the last census carried out from 2016 to 2018. The first one given by myself, it's going to be mainly related to the methods for this census and to what I think should be the strategy for monitoring the evolution of the Spanish population. Well, in general, how are large raptors population usually estimated? Well, the strategy is to prospect what is considered the nesting habitat, to locate the territories or the nest. You just then confirm the breeding status or breeding success of the territories you find, and then you estimate the population size. The number of individuals would be just the number of territories times 2, considering that you usually have a breeding pair. Well, this is, I would say, relatively easy when you have species that have restricted nesting habitats, for example, cliffs. That they have large nests or conspicuous nests and are relatively, and especially when they are territorial. So they are easy to find and they are relatively easy to count. We can consider the peregrine falcon, one example that of this species, or for example, the griffon vultures are another example in which in this case, what you locate are the colonies and you have to count the nest at the colonies. Which are the problems of these methods? Well, you start having problems when you have species that have a variety of nesting habitats, so they can nest in trees and nest in cliffs. Species that have inconspicuous nests or nesting caves or build small nests. Also, colonial species become more difficult because not only you have to locate the colony, but you need to estimate colony size. And always a problem related with this method is that you are only counting the breeding population. There is a non-breeding fraction that is not counted. In general, how are these census have been carried for lesser kestrels, and which are the problems? Well, lesser kestrel population in the case of Spain has a large breeding population and a large breeding distribution. They also are not very selective on nesting sites, so they have a variety of nesting habitats and substrates that can be from large buildings. They may nest in holes in mechinales, for example, in large buildings, but they can also nest under tiles in roofs. They can use nest boxes. They can even nest in holes in cliffs or under piles of stones. You have colonies of different size, and in many instances, the nests are difficult to access or difficult to count, especially consider counting nests in a tile roof. So how have the different census that have been carried in Spain been performed? Well, the strategy has been to locate colonies, usually visiting the historical sites, the historical colonies, plus what has been considered the adequate nesting sites, make repeated visits to these places to count all nests, and then estimate population size as the number of breeding pairs times 2. How have been these census been carried? Well, previous census in general have been not national census, but regional census. They were not really coordinated, that they have been using different methodologies. If we consider which have been the previous census, the first attempt was by Garzón in 1974, in which he estimated for ICVP a population size in Spain of the lesser kestrel of 50,000 breeding pairs. This was probably just an educated guess. It was not really a proper census. The first real census, we can attribute it to González and Merino in 1989, in which a total of 6,000 breeding pairs in Spain were counted. Probably these census were not really complete. Some areas were not really very well prospected, so there was an irregularity of the census effort. Atienza in 2001 estimated 2,000 breeding pairs by a compilation of different regional estimates that were probably more complete than the ones by González and Merino. But at the same time, it was expected that the population had been increasing. Other authors later considered that probably this estimate was an underestimate of the real population size. The first really attempt of a coordinated census for a complete coordinated census for the whole Spain and done in a single year was by SEO BirdLife in 2016. In fact, it was not possible to complete the census in 2016, and some areas were census in 2017 and 2018. This was a census carried with a really defined methodology. And actually, we were using two different methods. We carried what was called a complete colony census, as traditionally has been done, but at the same time, we did what is called a quick census. What is this quick census? Well, quick census is just the number.
Javier, perdona un momentito, perdona que le interrumpa. Es que no sé si tiene compartida la pantalla completa, porque se está viendo solo parcialmente, vamos, se están viendo las diapositivas, pero en tamaño más reducido.
Ok, perdona, sí, voy a ver si lo puedo arreglar. ¿Ahora?
Perfecto, muy bien.
Perfecto. Okay. Well, what we do consider as a quick census? A quick census is the maximum number of kestrels that are seen flying or perched at the colony during a 10-minute count, and it has to be performed during courtship in the 2 hours after sunrise or 2 hours before sunset. Why it works? Well, it works because lesser kestrels attend the colonies to select a nest and select a mate, and they are usually present when conditions are not optimal for feeding, so early in the morning when the temperatures are not very high or late in the evening. And they do this on all the time since they arrive from migration until they start egg laying. So in the case of Spain, from mid-February until May. All birds will breed at the colony, are usually present, and in most colonies it's much easier to count the birds, especially if they are flying, than to count nests. Well, the Spanish lesser kestrel census was carried, as I say, in 2016-2018. This was a coordinated effort by SEO BirdLife. Blas Molina and Juan Carlos del Moral were the coordinators. I participated with them in the design of the methodology, and this has been published as a monograph by the Spanish Ornithological Society, El Cernícalo Primilla en España, the number 53, and you have here the reference of the book. Juan Carlos will give a talk later in which he will get into the details of the numbers. And as I tell you, I'm going just to deal mainly with the methods. As I tell you, we tried to perform a quick census at all colonies. This quick census was performed in the period from 15th March to 20 April. It had to be done in a 2-hour interval after sunrise or before sunset. And the method was to count the maximum number of lesser kestrels that were seen simultaneously in a 10-minute interval. At the same time, for selected colonies, we perform a complete census. For this, it had to be performed repeated visits during reproduction to count all breeding attempts. Regional coordinators were asked to select a sample of colonies of different size, and at the same time, at least all large colonies. The census was carried from 20 April to mid-July. There was not a specific time for the complete census. In general, it was suggested if it was necessary to enter the colony, not to devote more than 2 hours, but the census could be carried at any time of the day. And the method was in general adapted to the type of colony. In total, 5,184 breeding localities were visited for the census. The quick census was performed in 4,236 localities. The complete census in 2,209. Both methods in 1,307 breeding localities, but not all of them were really adequate for modeling. So we selected 339 colonies in which the census was performed exactly as designed, both a quick census and a complete census. From this data, we could, by the analysis of this data, we could confirm that the number of breeding pairs is equal to the number of birds counted, the maximum number counted in 10 minutes divided by 2. So in general, all birds that are breeding at the colony are present during courtship and are easy to be counted in a 10-minute visit to the colony. So you could estimate the number of breeding pairs just with a mathematical model, just a linear regression could do. So the number of breeding pairs could be just a constant plus the quick census maximum count multiplied by a factor. Well, as I tell you, this could be enough, but especially if you want to estimate the errors of the counts, this requires a little bit more modeling. The mathematical details can be found in the monograph, but here I showed you the equations that were used to model the population. ICE is the number of individuals at the colony, and PCE is just the number of breeding pairs, so it's just dividing the previous figure by 2. Some of the difference that make compared to a linear regression is that it's important to have both variables, the predicted variables and the predictors on the same scale. So work with the number of individuals, not try to figure out the number of breeding pairs from the number of individuals. It's also important to log transform the variables because the errors increase with colony size. And also it's important to force the regression through the origin to avoid the artifact that you might just count 0 individuals at one site and the model would predict a positive value. This is just an example of the different models that were tested. On the right, you can see the predictions, well, a scatter plot of the observed data and the model predictions, the lines, on a linear scale, and on the left you can see these same models on a logarithmic scale. As you can see, the green model is the final model, but it's compared to a blue line with the linear regression and a red line, which is a model that is working with untransformed variables. The blue line has the problem that it overestimates the size of the colony in small colonies. You can see it pointed on the blue arrow, and underestimate the size of the large colonies as it's pointed by the red arrow. Well, this is just to show the distribution of the breeding population in 2016-2018. The size of the dots indicates the size of the colonies. Juan Carlos will later deal with more detail on this. One of the good things of this method compared to previous census is that it's possible to estimate effort and to have an idea of which areas have been really well census and which ones are not so well census. So in this case, for example, we consider that to get a good population, to consider that an area had been well prospected, at least 95% of the historical sites had to be visited, and at least 20% of the places that had been visited were colonies that were found empty. Why is this? Because we know in general that a lot of the places didn't have breeding pairs. So if an area you get a very low proportion of unoccupied nest sites, you can estimate that really the effort of locate all adequate nesting habitats was not really good. It's important to show that many of the colonies are very small colonies. So with the data of the whole census, we see that 25% of the breeding localities had just one breeding pair. So it's very easy to miss a large proportion of population if not an adequate effort of prospecting has been done. Another important thing is how we should estimate the population trend. As you have seen, well, Garzón in 1974 estimated that there could be over 50,000 breeding pairs in Spain, while González and Merino in 1989 estimated just 6,000, and Atienza in a census that we considered was probably underestimated was estimating 12,000. Which is this just errors in the census, or is just that the population has been fluctuating? To try to find out what has happened, what we did is to evaluate all the information available from historical census in the last 40 years. And in this graph, we are showing what we estimate in a red line has been the population trend for the last 30 years. What we have been using is those regions, the Spanish regions that had at least 4 or more census during the last 40 years. To be able to adjust the models, we transform those data. So what you see here, every point, is just the proportion of the maximum number of counts. So when you see 1, is that in that year, we obtain the maximum number of count at that region. And if you see 0.4, is that in that year, only 40% of the maximum number of breeding pairs have been counted in that year. This allows to consider all regions independently of having a large or a small population. Usually large areas with a large population are not so well estimated and usually have less data, while there are some small regions that have been prospected almost every year. If the model is adjusted with a local regression with a 50% span. And considering this, you can see that the population in Spain has been increasing since the 80s until 2010. So we can probably consider that during 1989, in the census carried by González and Merino, the population was at the lowest level. And from then it had been increasing. And although it has been said that the population in general has been steadily increasing, what we find out is that probably there was a maximum number of breeding pairs around 2010. And from then, the population has started again to decline quite dramatically. So what can we say about the estimating population trends is that what we find with in this census is that it's relatively easy to estimate population trend just using the strategy of quick census. And it's also not really necessary to census the complete population every year. So what is really important is to have a really a good estimate with a monitored effort. We consider that just census in 10% of the breeding localities, and in this case, it could do with just census in 500 breeding localities would be enough if this is done every year to have a good estimate of the population trend. For this, we perform a geographically and colony stratified random selection of breeding colonies that is presented in the appendix of the monograph. 500 breeding localities that should be census every year with a 10-minute count during courtship, and this would be enough to establish the population trend. Why is just this a good method? Because it really requires very low investment just to have a good and adequate monitoring of the Spanish population trend. As you have seen, some people and some published data are indicating that the European, or at least the Spanish population is still increasing, but in fact we know that it has been probably declining for the last 10 years. And this would just require relatively low investment because it can be done with a network of local volunteers that can monitor the selected colonies. Okay, this is all for my part. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Javier. Doy paso a nuestra compañera Juncal, porque creo que hay alguna pregunta para el ponente, para Javier Bustamante. Sí que agradeceríamos que las respuestas sean lo más concisas posible y pido también a los ponentes, en la medida de lo posible, que intenten ajustarse al máximo para no ir acumulando retrasos en el desarrollo del Congreso. Juncal.
Sí, a ver, la pregunta es si cree que censar en mayo en las horas centrales del día puede infravalorar el resultado del censo.
Sí, es decir, el problema es que normalmente la gente piensa que un censo completo es un censo más preciso, pero es decir, en mayo ya para empezar los cernícalos están incubando, con lo cual es muy probable que muchos de los individuos no sean visibles porque están dentro de los nidos y por lo tanto se estima mal el tamaño de población. Las horas centrales del día, por la misma razón, los individuos no suelen estar presentes en la colonia, sino que están alimentándose. Es decir, es muy frecuente que en las horas centrales del día en mayo la hembra esté incubando y el macho esté cazando, con lo cual cualquier conteo que se haga en ese momento casi seguro que va a infraestimar el tamaño de la colonia.
Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Javier Bustamante. Pasamos